Greetings all, Dr. Raphael X here with another video. Please subscribe, click on the like button, all that good stuff. Share this video. Before anything else, let us begin with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, Mr. Jeffrey Trissell here, my friend, has wrote a very interesting book on unlocking the churches. The legal victory against California's pandemic era religious discrimination. So what's interesting here is he worked pretty much on the front lines, and you correct me here, Jeffrey, if anything. He worked in the front lines in three court cases during the lockdowns where basically a religious right was basically denied, totally marginalized, to say the least. And he won two of those court cases against Governor Newsom's kind of very drastic, radical, and frankly unconstitutional and immoral lockdowns, right? Especially with the churches and kind of this. You see this selectiveness in the sense that this impartiality where this can be locked down, churches and other things like rioting. Essentially, there was no legal action taken against that. So yeah, if you could explain a little bit on this very interesting book, he does is it's not super legalistic, but he does give a legal primer at the beginning, which it helps to guide you through some of the legal language. But it's excellent. It's a must read, and it's an eye opener. So please, if you could talk a little bit, Jeffrey, about the context of the book, your involvement here in the lockdowns, and yeah, what brought you to write this book?
Right. So depending on where in the country you were, right, in which state, there were various levels of lockdown during the pandemic, and various levels of lockdown for different industries. So in California, we had a particularly draconian lockdown of churches, where Governor Newsom issued a statewide order. I think we had the first statewide order in the country, locking down all of our industries, everything that's not essential, and that included churches. And he also kept that really for longer than anybody else. We didn't really fully reopen our churches until February of 2021 when my law firm won a victory at the U.S. Supreme Court. So I think one of the things people don't realize about this legal fight was A, how different it was across the states, and B, the the ups and downs. So when Governor Newsom first started reopening industries, and a lot of the country started reopening in May of 2020, um, my law firm filed a lawsuit and made a really big push to try to get churches fully reopened. And we ended up losing at the U.S. Supreme Court in May 2025 to 4, and set a really horrible precedent that allowed governors carte blanche to discriminate against churches for the next 6 months until it was reversed out of a case in New York, and then we got a similar reversal with respect to California in February 2021. So we were involved with this case, really all the ups and downs, the initial losses and then the final wins.
Also, and that 5-4 was it Justice Roberts who wrote that? Was it forgive my false terminology here, the majority view? He's the one who was the tie-breaking vote. Was that controversial? Is that right?
Right. Yes. So these emergency applications, right, when normally a lawsuit takes, many years to be resolved, especially through appeals. Um, and we got after we filed our lawsuit, we were in front of the Supreme Court in 3 weeks, right? So that's record-breaking time. That's ridiculous. And normally, when you have an emergency application to the U.S. Supreme Court in this context, you would get a one-word opinion, denied, right? There's no need to write anything more. The Supreme Court would rarely ever considers these emergency applications, except when we have essentially extreme exigent circumstances. And we thought we were in that context here. And so, might as well try, see if they'll issue an order requiring Governor Newsom to open the churches. And instead of just saying denied, which is what they probably should have done, Justice Roberts decided to write a concurring opinion. So the majority opinion really was just the one word denied. But Justice Roberts decided to write his own opinion explaining why he joined the liberal justices to vote against the churches. And although that opinion is not binding on anybody, but it was still cited by 300 court cases in the next 6 months, explaining why they were ruling against churches and not allowing them to reopen when they filed lawsuits.
Right. Going to back to the point you mentioned before is because obviously it's a constitutional right to practice the religion, but if there is a national emergency, can these rights be curtailed, especially the First Amendment in particular, the freedom of religion when it involves gatherings? Can these are they considered absolute rights? If that terminology makes sense in the Constitution, I'm not sure because I'm not sure in the law rather. I'm not sure if the law. I'm sure the law distinguishes like a relative and absolute right. But so are these rights kind of not? I don't want to say circumstantial, but do they again could they be curtailed because of a national emergency?
Right. So the First Amendment, right, is actually very, very brief. It says and I should have it memorized, but it basically says the rights to freedom of speech shall not be curtailed. The right of the free exercise of religion shall not be curtailed. Right. And so what does that mean? Right? Shall not be curtailed. Like nobody really knows. And so it's a lot of judicial interpretation, a lot of looking back at what has happened in history and what's been bad about what's happened in history. So one of the themes that runs through the book is that when we have these national emergencies, we often buckle, right? The courts buckle and they say, "Oh, well, okay, you can do that," right? And so the best example really is the Japanese internment camps, when the U.S. Supreme Court voted in a challenge to that was okay, and then we get back to peacetime. And the court says, well, we really shouldn't do stuff like that. We should be strict and strong during wartime. And then we get a pandemic and the court buckles again. And after the pandemic's over, the court says, "Oh, well, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. We should be we should be strong and defend religious liberty and free speech during wartime." And so, like there's a practical aspect to it where throughout our history and even now up to 2020, we have times when we have national emergencies and personal liberties are restricted. But the there's a lots of judicial opinions saying you're not supposed to do that.
Right, right. Oh, so you're arguing that they're wrong in principle and in practice. And yes, you do kind of see that's interesting. Okay, yeah. So it does seem that the constitutional right of religious freedom seems to be like a second tier right, almost subject to others. It's kind of like it has diminished in importance, and it's I don't know if you can comment a little bit on that.
Right. So when I first wrote the book, well, when I first started drafting the idea for the book, right, it was in the aftermath of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and I think a lot of us were still very much dealing with the trauma of the pandemic. And at that time, I think, we were it was a weird place, right? Trump had lost, we had a new president, and we had new Supreme Court justices, but the the way religious liberty has been treated in the past since 1990, from 1990 to 2020, was really as a second tier right. And I think we're moving in a positive direction now, and it's kind of an interesting. I think it was probably a result of the pandemic where we all kind of realized, wait a minute, like we let this go too far, and we need to stand up for our rights.
Right.
But definitely um, before Justice Ginsburg left the court and was replaced with Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the court was very reluctant to give strong protection to religious liberty. And now I think because we have such a majority on the Supreme Court of six conservative justices, a lot of the religious liberty law firms are pushing really hard to try to get good legal precedent supporting religious freedom. And I don't know how willing the court is to move that fast. The court is it's like the church; it moves slowly.
Right, right. No, and it again, it does seem because it's due to diminished religiosity where we don't recognize. I mean, the first being who has rights is God, right? The virtue of religion, which stems from the cardinal virtue of justice, where we owe God, or we owe God worship. So it seems like this kind of pervasive atheism is what is at stake, unless religious freedom can serve me somehow, like with the Satanic Church using, they're trying to, I don't know how that worked. Maybe you can comment on that, if it worked or not. They're trying to have abortion as a religious right, as opposed to, and now it becomes something that um, becomes important, at least for the kind of the atheistic mindset. So it's really sad that kind of worship is what we're primarily called to do. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's a very unfortunate case. I mean, I think, and the annoying thing there is that they may very well be successful. I don't think they've been successful yet. They've been filing
Mm,
or trying this strategy in multiple jurisdictions. But I think from a interpretation of modern legal jurisprudence, it's not a bad strategy to argue that you have a religious right to abortion, and therefore, because right now the courts are moving in the direction of protecting religious rights. Um,
right.
and the court has always been very reluctant to basically say no, like obviously no, um, because there are a lot of religious beliefs out there that, from a Western-centric worldview, we might say obviously no, but are not that crazy. Like a lot of the Eastern religious ideas, Islamic ideas sometimes can be very foreign to our Christian heritage, and yet the court wants to respect those. And so they've kind of just adopted this rule of whatever your religion is whatever you say it is. And right. And so then we get satanic religion saying that we want to have abortion.
Right. That's interesting because in the legal system, they're not really prone to define things. So what is the definition of religion? Is it kind of like whatever you want it to be?
That 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 is a very complicated question. So basically,
It's,
um,
mm,
the further, I mean, I actually think that the definition that comes to mind is kind of a circular one, where it's, um, and I believe it's a case from like the 1970s, where the court was basically discussing how we all need to have some spiritual life. We need to have some belief in a higher power, some belief um, in eternal values to get us through the day, right? Like from a psychological perspective. And your religion can be anything that provides that for you, that kind of like the benefit of religion to you psychologically. And so,
mm,
you know, they would allow, almost like people joke sometimes that environmentalism is a religion. And to a certain degree, yeah, it could be under the viewed in the way the law views religion and because the law basically says, well, it's important because it provides a benefit to you, and the benefit it provides to you is our human need for um, something larger than ourselves to connect into,
right, right. Yeah, so, yeah, it's very broad. I mean, well, maybe we could do a
which
video
is a
on that.
horrible definition of religion too.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe in the future we could do a video because that's really fascinating from a legalistic perspective to kind of have to pinpoint this definition. But yeah, that's really so. So why so for example, should worship be subject to other activities, or rather, are there circumstances where certain activities are permitted and other activities like religious activities are not? What is the justification for that? Did they address this kind of hypocrisy that's going on? And I guess that's why, and also if you get into your cases, I guess that's where you won your two cases, the two out of three.
Right. Um, so part of the problem was that the legal test for whether something violates the First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion has changed quite a bit over the past 75 years. And partly it's because we don't have a good test, right? Like a lot
Mm,
of our tests, we try to look to like a historical tradition and an analogous circumstances. So like for the Second Amendment, it's we apply a very reasoning by analogy. It's not just that you can have muskets, but you can have weapons that would be used for the same purpose that you would use a musket at the founding of the country, right? Self-defense, maybe hunting, like that. But it's very, we try to apply reasoning by analogy. And for the free exercise of religion, because we were founded as a Christian nation, it's hard to say these these types of activities get protection and these don't, right? So like obviously the core, really the core one should be the right to go to church, right? Like that's the simplest and most um practically central of the ways that you would exercise your religion, right? But the court never wanted to limit it to that, right? So you say, well, the way I exercise my religion is also by um well, whatever people do, right? Like I like to pray at school. I pray before meals, right? That's a good example. Well, you're in a public school, and there's no prayer allowed in public schools. So can you pray before meals or not, right? And so we should have, our religious rights should expand beyond obviously just going to church. And when we create a test that applies neutrally to all the different ways you can exercise your religion, it kind of ignores the elephant in the room, whereas like the thing that should never ever be prohibited is actually going to church, like perhaps the most central thing to exercising your religious beliefs. Um, and I think that was the problem during the pandemic is that we were trying to apply these tests that would apply similarly to whether you wanted to, run a business without having to participate in a same-sex wedding.
Right, right,
And
right,
it really should be like different test if you want to go to church. That test should be you can never ever prohibit it. But anyway, the test that we were applying was is this analogous to other uh, activities that are permitted, right? And in that respect, I don't know if the court ever really believed that it was analogous. So basically, Governor Newsom and the other governors argued that going to shopping is not analogous to going to a church. Going to church is analogous to going to a concert because you're sitting next to people, close proximity, breathing the similar air with loud music, oftentimes, causing you to um, release more water droplets as you speak loud.
hmm
And if you sit next to those people for an hour, then more likely that you would transmit the COVID, right? If you go shopping, you're passing by people, you're not spending a lot of time next to people. If you go to a restaurant, you're further separated and you're not necessarily singing and speaking as loudly. So they try to create all these distinctions, saying it's not directly analogous. Going to church is more dangerous than going to these other places. And essentially, by the end of the pandemic, the court did not think that they were analogous anymore. Or the court originally thought that they were distinguishable, and then the court changed its mind and said, no, they're actually analogous. So if you're allowing people to go dining, you have to allow people to go to church.
right.
And whether they really were analogous, I don't know. I think the court probably, to a certain degree, just agreed that you can never really ban going to church. That's that should be beyond the pale.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, there's no analogy here. I mean, you're in a different realm, but I think just because of the lack of faith. I mean, back then in medieval times with pandemics, they would pray more. They would have processions, and it's just a
Mhm.
lack of faith, very prevalent. It's very sad where you're equating this with this, looking basically on kind of like a reductive, naturalistic reasons, basically. It's very kind of sad, actually. Um, so why do you think the George Floyd riots, basically, protests in some places, riots in other places, why
Mhm.
were they permitted while churches could not gather? And we're talking about gatherings outside and people in masks outside, as opposed to the rioting, people in close outside, but people in close proximity, and not a lot of people using, or not everyone using masks. So why was there this um yeah, this partiality in that?
Um,
I guess there's no explanation, but I put
yeah,
you
I
on
mean, like,
the
yeah, it's politics, right? I mean, we had
spot.
an election coming up that November, and you really needed to speak in favor. I mean, it's funny, right? I think the November election really meant that everything had to go out the door and we had to support these rioters if you were on the Democrat side, even if it really made clear how unfair it was, right, to everybody else. Unfair to the churches that weren't allowed to open and unfair to all of us who are doing their best to actually lock down. I'm in Southern California, right? That's where the book is. The main plot is in the book, and yeah, my local Chase Bank was burned to the ground, right? Like not that far from me,
Wow.
and I'm just like, what? Like, I guess it's good that I bank elsewhere, um, but yeah, it was just crazy. And
No, no, yeah, that's
yeah,
insane how they definitely definitely politicking going around, which is hugely unfortunate for sure. But the um for example, it just escaped me. I'm sorry if you wanted to continue, 'cause I just
oh yeah, one
mind.
thing I wanted to say since
Yeah,
we're talking is that when I originally wrote the story here, I figured I would publish it in a legal journal, um, just because there's a lot of legalese in here. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that some of my favorite authors are people who are able to distill things down for a general audience. And so, I did a lot of work to try to make this accessible to the layman. And even if I'm using a lot of complex terms now and not distilling them very good, or very well, the book is much better in terms of trying to go slowly and explain all the different legal concepts that are at issue.
right. You definitely, yeah, I appreciate that. I remember what I wanted to ask you was so the essential stores were left open during the lockdowns and liquor stores were left open. So could someone see that as potentially, I mean, I need liquor for religion, for example, religious purposes, because the what you talked about religion is very broadly outlined, whatever gives me some type of psychological benefit. Basically,
Right.
it seems like it's that subjective. So why were liquor stores left open during the pandemic? I mean, are we that much in need of alcohol?
That is actually a question I never really fully researched, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, so in when I grew up, I didn't grow up in California. Our liquor stores, our grocery stores do not have liquor in them. But here in Southern California, all the grocery stores have liquor. So, like you would think there'd be no problem to just shut down the liquor stores and say, if you very much need liquor, get it at your grocery store.
Right.
Uh, but it it was a balancing of the essentiality of the thing, right? Medical care, food, versus the risk of transmittal of the virus at that location. So, grocery stores, they generally view them as low risk because you're not standing next to somebody. You're walking by. I mean, obviously, if you're standing in line, then you're right next to somebody and balance that against the high need, right? The high need in terms of you need to get food. Uh, and so grocery stores were obviously considered essential. Why liquor stores specifically were considered essential? I guess I always assumed that it was primarily the low risk and not so much the high essential of liquor. But
Oh,
maybe I'm giving too much of a benefit to the bureaucrats who decided that.
a very good outlook. Yeah. Yeah. So what did the in general, what did the pandemic reveal about the dangers of state intervention with regard to right, separation of powers? What does it reveal? Is there something lurking behind? Well, there always is, but kind of what does it tell us about potential dangers or future dangers? Could this happen again, or how do we avoid this?
Right. I think the scary thing for me was that after about late May 2020, we switched from the point of view of we're going to have lots of lawyers filing lots of lawsuits, the best lawyers in the country, right? Like I worked with some of the very best religious liberty lawyers at even at the US Supreme Court level, to we're not going to win. So now we're just going to disobey and do our very best to not get our clients arrested. right? So, of my three lawsuits, one was an affirmative action in federal court trying to get a ruling saying this needs to be struck down, these bans. And then my other two lawsuits were defensive lawsuits, were primarily defensive, where the government was coming after us and basically saying, we're going to get an order of contempt because you opened up your church. And, thankfully nothing ever happened to my client, but in Canada,
Mm.
they put fences around a church, right? And there's a case in Louisiana where the pastor was arrested under house arrest and with an ankle bracelet, right? And there's a case where a church is still fighting to um, get out from under $5 million of fines, right? So because they opened up and they didn't require people to wear masks, right? So afterwards they say, well, the fines related to just opening up, that was unconstitutional because the Supreme Court later said you were allowed to open up. But the Supreme Court never said that you could allow your people not to wear masks. So the fines, the millions of dollars in fines relating to not wearing masks during the pandemic, we're still coming after you for that. So I think the scary thing for me was not so much that the government would impose these absurd rules but that they would actually come after you if you disobeyed them. So in San Diego, we've become blue, but we used to be the last major red metropolitan area in California. And for the majority of the pandemic, it felt like the Catholic churches were following the rules, but a lot of the small independent churches, the Protestant independent churches, were not, right? And nobody was coming after them. But in other parts in California, right, lawsuits were being filed against churches and really trying to do whatever they can to shut them down. And to me, that kind of animus was scary.
Right, right. Yeah, why do that? I mean, that's crazy, especially in kind of in the pandemic where we know a little bit more about the COVID-19 and everything. And it's yeah, but what you alluded to is scary in the sense that how the bishops, the Catholic bishops, I can't name maybe one that really spoke up against the lockdowns. Obviously, at the beginning, everyone was for it because we thought it was something very grave, COVID-19, which it was for certain demographic. But the bishops generally just folded and totally became obedient to the state as if they were subject to it. So it's like the state usurped the churches. Usually, a lot of people complain about the church usurping the state's rights, but now it's it's the other way around. So yeah, it's crazy. So what legal recourse? So if this happens again, or in general, if something else happens where kind of like the faithful they face if they were to face unjust laws, what recourse do they have? I know there's the St. Thomas More Center who the president, I believe, wrote your forward, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the forward by Thomas Breccia. I never knew how to pronounce his last name. So the president of the Thomas More Society, they do a lot of great work. I know faithful can have recourse to them, but what else would you say? What can faithful do if the state were to come after them? Like, for example, the case you mentioned with the baker who, right, had to make a cake for a homosexual marriage, so-called marriage.
Well, I, I'm hopeful I never have to deal with anything like the pandemic again, right? But if we do, I think the main thing is we all need to stand up together, right? So if you have one church refusing to comply and opening up, that church is going to get a lawsuit filed against it pretty fast, right? And in California, we have 12 bishops, right? In San Diego, where we have 12 dioceses, right? And I guess there's auxiliary bishops too. We have 12 dioceses. And in San Diego, we had Bishop McElroy, who was um, being more on the progressive side. I don't think he was going to fight the lockdowns at all, right? But in Los Angeles and San Francisco, our two archdioceses, I don't think they didn't fight the lockdowns because they believed in them. I think they didn't fight them because they were afraid. They were
Mm,
afraid that this is California and that if they open up their churches in protest, um, the state is going to come down on them very hard.
Wow.
And the
Wow.
state has, right? Like, with our sex abuse crises, yes, there were problems, but those have also been exploited to really harm the church in California, resulting in obviously millions and millions of dollars in losses. And so I think the churches there were probably legitimately afraid that being in this hostile territory, if they opened up, um, the government would come down on them very hard. But I still think that would be the best strategy, is we need to have a united front. There was in Wisconsin, I believe, maybe Michigan, I forget. Uh, I remember reading a letter from all of the bishops. It was a letter to the governor, basically saying, we're opening up, period. We're doing it together. We don't care that your order says we have to stay locked down. We're opening up our churches. And I believe that was the right thing to do at the time. That was the right approach.
Right, right. Yeah, basically living that principle. I think I've read it somewhere in your book. A faith worth a faith worth dying for is a faith worth living for. We have to live our faith. No one can stop us from practicing our faith. No one should be able to stop us from practicing our faith. And excellent. So, guys, get this book. Very interesting from many different aspects. Very important, a vital book, I would say. Actually, in the back it says a must read for every American and person of faith. Unlocking the Churches. The link to get the book is below, published by Crisis Magazine, by the way, Crisis Publications. And yeah, I'll give you the last word if you want to say any closing thoughts.
Yes, as you mentioned, the majority of the cases discussed in the book were litigated by the Thomas More Society. I'm outside special counsel. I help litigate their cases in California, but I work for a private law firm. But they had some of the best cases, they had the strongest fight. They filed most of the cases across the country. They're a very prominent Catholic nonprofit law firm. And if you ever need anything, you should reach out to them and they'll assign a lawyer to help you.
That's right. Yeah, they're excellent. They're excellent. And also help them out if you can. I think they take donations, of course.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, it's been great, and thank you for watching. And check out that book. And also, Jeffrey, if you want to send me anything like link, for example, any links that you have, I don't know, any blogs, whatever, that would also be in the description on the bottom. All right. Well, thank you very much. God bless you all, and until next time, take care now.
Thank you.